Hey everybody, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Hey Oscar, how you doing?
Good, Mark. How are you?
I'm glad you brought the weather from New York to London for this quick 24 hours. Look, super excited to welcome everybody to today's call. My name is Mark Hamill. I'm chairman of the Virtual Advisory Board and also a chair with REF here in the UK. We've got our upcoming forum session this week with Frank and Andy and the rest of the crew. So super excited to see everybody there on Wednesday. I'm delighted to share today's session, the partnership between REF and Ipsos on bringing global leaders the latest trends in foresight and helping them anticipate and shape the future. This is part of a series that REF puts together, inviting leaders from around the world to share experiences. And we're absolutely delighted to have Oscar, who's the CEO of Strategy3, Ipsos marketing, brand, and innovation consultancy, where he's the global president. In his role as partner and executive advisor, Oscar leads select client engagements, having served clients such as Target, Procter & Gamble, Nordstrom, Samsung, and McDonald's. Prior to joining Strategy3, Oscar was a founding partner and head of brand at Kantar Vermeer, where he led client engagements in industries as diverse as travel, financial services, technology, and CPG. With almost 20 years of marketing experience from both agency and client perspectives, Oscar is a frequently featured speaker and commentator on brands and brand building. Oscar has delivered keynotes at Diageo and Kellogg's and Johnson & Johnson, as well as a series of guest lectures at Boston and Cornell University. He's appeared as a guest on CNBC and NPR and is a contributor to the FT, Business Week, and Fortune. Oscar holds an MBA from Harvard Business School and 2 undergraduate degrees from Stanford, Economics and International Relations. In addition to English, he also speaks French and Mandarin Chinese. Oscar, what a pleasure to have you on the call today.
Likewise, Mark. Good to be here, and thanks for the intro.
Well, look, beers or coffees on me next time in London. I know this is a whistle-stop tour, so delighted to catch you while you're here. And thanks so much again for giving time to today's session. We're live at the moment. So Oscar, look, over to you. We'll take, obviously, people can man the chats, drop questions or comments in the chat function. We'll go to Q&A after a while. But first of all, over to you, Oscar, and a huge thank you.
Fantastic, Mark. Thank you. And like I said, feel free to drop notes in the chat, questions. We do have time built in at the end for a short discussion, so looking forward to that. All right. As Mark said, I lead an organization that is a trends, foresight, and innovation consultancy. I do a lot of speaking on trends and foresight. And the reason why we call this Eyes over here, funnily enough, is because I'm surprised constantly when I do this speaking how often business leaders miss what's directly in front of their eyes. They miss the things that actually are really macro trends that will shape business in the next decades. If you think about the things that people talk about when it comes to trends these days, it's exactly this type of stuff. We're talking about convenience, we're talking about sustainability, diversity, health and wellness, right? And undoubtedly, these are really critical things for businesses to think about. But as I said, there are often things that are bigger, perhaps a bit more impactful even beyond these. We need to focus on these undoubtedly. But there are things that I think are probably a bit more impactful that we often miss that are right in front of our noses. So what I want to do is talk to you today about 3 of those big macro global shifts that we're tracking here at Ipsos that perhaps will be impactful for you and your businesses. So those 3 areas, one is this idea of an emptier planet. And the concept behind this is that we will see a population decline in the next decade or so around the world. In the next couple decades, that will get quite impactful. So we'll talk quickly about what that means. The second is this idea of a deglobalized globe. We're going to start operating in a world that is increasingly deglobalized, which will be a shift from what we understand today. And then the last thing is what I call reworking work. And that's something I'm sure many of you are navigating with your workforces and what that means for many of our businesses. So let's just go through these one by one. The first is this idea of an emptier planet. And let me start by a little provocation here for you. So for those of you that I think are perhaps under 60, we will be the first generation in human history to have fewer people in the world at the end of our lives than at the beginning. So let me say that again. So imagine this, that there will be fewer people on this planet at the end of our lives than at the beginning. And this is not simply, something provocative for you. There are kind of numerical demographic shifts that we're looking at, right? So here's just a slide quickly on the projected population growth rates of different places around the world. And you see, Africa obviously is very high growth rate, but that's declining quickly. Every single one of these areas, Oceania, North America, South America, Asia, are declining quickly. Europe is saying flat, but essentially what this says is that around the middle of this century, around 2065, I believe, the net is that the world population will start to decrease. And you know, that's an interesting fact. I think it's an interesting thing to think about, but there's enormous implications for all of that, right? So on top of this provocation, I'll just provide you with a couple of stats here, right? So think about this. The worldwide population is projected to peak at 9.7 billion, as I said, 2064, declining to 8.5 billion by 2100. Now that's, you know, a 12.5% decline over those 36 years, which comes out to about 35 million people less a year. So think about this. This is a country the size of Canada just falling off the face of the earth every single year, right? And so for businesses that have always thought about, well, we can do business as usual, we're always going to get a 1% population increase every year and we'll continue to grow that way, that is going to flip on its head, right? But it's not just simply the absolute numbers we're looking at, and we're also looking at how those numbers are distributed, right? So not only will this show a total decline, it's showing declines and increases in different areas, right? So it'll reorganize global population distribution away from Asia, where the growth is today, towards Africa, where we're seeing enormous growth. And that'll be a very interesting shift for us as well. And also it'll change the population pyramid, right? So what we're looking at now is we're going to have a huge increase in the numbers of older people, right? So by 2050, mind you, it's 2024 now, essentially, in the next 25 years, that's going to be a 4-year increase in life expectancy in 40s. And that's an enormous shift, right? So people are going to live longer and longer, and there's implications of that as well. So just specifically, what does that mean? And I'll talk through, you know, this is the structure. We'll talk through a provocation, a couple of stats for you, and look at a couple of implications that I see in businesses. So the first one is this idea of, you know, this demographic shift, right? So demographic transitions pose increasingly difficult challenges for maturing economies. So I'll give you a stat here. The US in the last 50 years, 30% of the economic growth in the US was driven by an increase in labor force, right? So you think about 30% of the growth that the US saw was because the labor force got bigger and bigger. And now we're going to start looking at a labor force that starts declining, right? So the key point here is, you know, we need to really start thinking about the structure of our labor force and how we do this. So countries like Japan, countries like China, for example, have more senior workers who are retired than there are younger workers who are feeding the economy, right? So what does that mean? At the same time, this also means there's going to be fewer and fewer consumers for organizations to look at, right? And if this gives you any sense of what might happen, if you think about Japan, obviously, the fun stat I have is that last year, for the first time, Japan sold more diapers for senior people than it did diapers for infants. And so what the result of that is an aging population. Japan, as many of you know, has been on a steady economic, has been in economic trouble for 30 years, for one generation, right? And it's not until very recently that they started turning that around. So really, there's a huge impact of this idea of this demographic shift that we're looking at. As I said, the second outcome of this shrinking planet is that we're going to start reorienting where we spend our energies, right? So many of you, if I asked how many of you knew what city this is, probably very few of you would call out that this is Lagos, Nigeria, right? Now, mind you, Lagos is a city of about 25 million people, which is the population of Australia. It's roughly the size of Shanghai, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, right? The metropolitan areas. And yet, how few of us know Lagos very well, the way that we might know Shanghai, the way that we might know Sao Paulo as a growing metropolis, right? So I think a lot of the work that we have to do as business leaders is start shifting and thinking about where we think our business comes from. What are the big centers for business in the world, to include cities like Lagos as the population shift moves away from the centers we know now to what we think the centers will look like in the future. And then just lastly, when we talk about a shrinking planet, I think a key piece of it will be how our business is going to react to this, right? And we know businesses today always chasing after the Gen Z consumer, the young consumer. What is it going to look like when we need to start looking at older consumers, right? And I'll give you an example here of brands needing to find growth beyond their increasing their customers. Nike as a company rolled out this shoe called the Cruiser 1. Nike has always created shoes for the runner, for the marathon runner who has long, hard strides that hit the ground very hard with great force. Realizing that the population is getting older and they're going to have to create more and more products for seniors, they've created the shoe, the Cruiser 1, which has been designed and engineered so that it supports the feet of people who are slower walkers, that have shorter gaits, right? Not the long, heavy strides that marathon runners have. And so thinking about organizations and what we need to do to start thinking about this shift to a smaller planet, Nike is one example of a company that's made that move. So the questions are, how do we thrive? What are we going to have to do? And just 3 thoughts here. One is, I think, really rethink our labor force and product mixes. How do we accommodate these changing demographics? Like, what does it mean, for example, if we have employees that are beyond retirement age, and that becomes more and more common, right? What does it mean to start creating products for some of these older citizens? I think the second thing was my nudge around Lagos, is thinking about how do we develop a deeper understanding of new and emergent markets, perhaps that we don't think about as commonly today. And then lastly was the Nike example, how do we explore new ways to add value to our existing customers, right? As I said, for a long time, if we did nothing, if we just did business as usual, we could see every year, 1% growth or 1.5% growth, right? That baseline of growth is no longer guaranteed as we head towards the middle of the century, and we're looking at a population decline in most of our markets. Okay, so the second interesting macro shift is this idea of deglobalized globe. And what this means is, for the longest time, I'd say even since the beginning of commerce, right? The more markets you are in, the more opening of markets, the more you visited from Marco Polo onwards, right? The better for your business, right? The more we globalize, the more we reached beyond our local market, the better. And for the first time, I think after decades and decades of increasing globalization, we're entering, for the first time, a period of deglobalization, right? And I think this is huge implications for us, and just some stats as we do. In 2023, 75% of consumers, this is Ipsos data that we run every year, 75% of consumers preferred to buy products from their home country rather than from abroad. And mind you, this is a 4% increase. And when you look at things like a 4% increase on a global level, that's quite a significant shift. Many of you, of course, know that we're seeing increasing nationalist sentiment growing in many countries, from the US to Brazil to Maloney in Italy to the UK. Support for populist candidates has grown by 42%. So we're starting to see increasing consumer sentiment around, hey, I want to protect my own country, right? The little nationalist protectionism is on the rise. And it follows, tariffs are increasing. The US tariffs on Chinese exports were around 20%, whereas before the trade war, they were around 7%. And so again, it's pointing to the fact that we are slowly closing ourselves off from trade from the highest levels that we've seen, right? And then not surprisingly, much of this is driven by the idea of supply chain impact, right? And we saw through COVID, 75% of companies said, hey, I'm not going to expose myself to the risk of producing it in some country where I don't have very much control, right? So I think this idea of deglobalization has some really profound impacts on our businesses, right? The first of which is thinking about, we've spent so much time thinking about offshoring. How do we revisit that strategy, right? This is a picture from one of the 2 new Intel fabs semiconductor fabs that Intel has built in Arizona. They are currently planning to spend another $20 billion on 2 more in Ohio, right? And Intel saying, I can't subject myself to the risk of another supply chain disruption if, for example, something like COVID happens. If China and Taiwan go south and we have a incident there, I think we basically protecting ourselves from the risk, right? So that's one way in companies are thinking about this idea of deglobalization. The second is really consider the power and draw of relevant, thriving local brands. And this is an interesting story about Starbucks that tried to enter Australia. And I don't know if I have any Australians on the call, but we know Australians are quite particular about their coffee. And Starbucks, tried to move into Australia the same way they've moved into many other countries, which is, hey, take what works, right? Whether that's a venti, a grande, a tall, their lingo, their words, their products, and just export to Australia. Australia is kind of like the US, they might say. They lost $105 million in the first year trying to do so, right? Realizing that they weren't able to compete with the local brands like Gloria Jeans with 400 stores, about 35 million customers a year, right? That really tailor their offering to the Australian taste, right? They have their own language around flat whites, specialty Australian drinks, right? So the idea that you can lift and shift what works in one country to another country is increasingly being called into question, Starbucks being an example. And then lastly, this is kind of a fun one. Those of you who recognize BTS here, I think it's not insignificant, it's not just fun, but the idea of, with these increased trade tariffs, right, suppose there's less physical trade in the world, there's increased 3D printing, right? So many of the things that are engineered somewhere, I can actually manufacture at home. I don't need the physical exchange of goods anymore. What are the things that we do export? What are the things that we do share, right? And South Korea has figured this out beautifully, right? As they think about what are some of the biggest South Korean export these days? Of course, there's Samsung, of course, there's Hyundai, but South Korea these days is really known the world over for K-pop, right? For K-beauty, for culture, for content, right? From BTS, as you see here, to things like Parasite, which we all watch, to Squid Game, right? So the idea that thinking about if we are no longer able, or if the idea of trading physical goods is actually decreasing, what are the exports that we could really press out there? And content, culture, influence, I think are all areas to be thinking about as we think about what trade in the future looks like. Those are a bit more borderless, a bit more less subject to things like supply chain disruptions. Now, how do we thrive in this context? I think we've touched on all of these. I think first is revisiting supply chains. And I say all the time, think about continuity rather than cost, right? We've been thinking all this time about how do we decrease our cost by offshoring. Now it's how do I ensure business continuity, right? It can cost a little bit more, but really how do I ensure that I don't suffer through what we suffered in 2021, 2022 with supply chain disruptions. I think the power and strength of local brands is increasingly provocative and interesting for people. Really, what does that mean? What can we learn from them? Or how do we leverage them as we continue to grow? It's no longer a lift and shift strategy that perhaps works for many multinationals, right? And then, as I said, maybe inspired by BTS, think about, what are the possibilities of export in the non-durable supply chain resilient realm, right? Again, with higher tariffs, for example, with supply chain limitations, with 3D printing, perhaps the exchange, I mean, again, this is far out, right? But perhaps thinking about the exchange of content, of culture, of influence through those means might be an interesting exploration to think about. And the last one, and we'll talk about this briefly and then save time for a bit of questions and discussion, is this idea of reworking work, right? And the big provocation here, and I think, perhaps less a provocation, many of you are seeing this and living this on a day-to-day basis, is this idea that COVID initiated a reimagining of work, the workplace, and the workforce. It will redefine the next generation of work. And I think, as I said, many of you are seeing this already, right? If you think about some of the stats that we see, when offered the opportunity to work remotely, 87% of employees take it. Flexibility is the #1 driver for job seekers these days. This is an interesting one. In the US, 44% of gig workers consider freelancing to be their primary income source. And the number of freelancers is going to grow from 57 to 86 million by 2027. So the idea of having, full-time career-driven work is decreasing. It's moving towards gig work, and we see this globally. And then finally, I think this is an interesting provocation, which I'll talk to in a good deal of detail. 78% of business leaders participating in a pilot in the UK say the transition to a 4-day work week was seamless. I think the UK did a study. They took 41 companies, put them on a 4-day work week, and then asked them how they did. 39 of those 41 companies says we're going to switch to a 4-day work week. Fortunately, many of them might be too old to enjoy this for too long, but it is a big shift that we see happening. And again, when I speak to trends, I usually don't make predictions. That's a little bit a no-no when you're speaking about trends to make a prediction. There is one area I will make a prediction on, is that in the next 5 to 10 years, we will move to a 4-day work week globally. And there's huge implications of that, right? So one, if you think about what our infrastructure looks like, much of our infrastructure has been designed around the presumption of a 5-day in-office presence, right? This is actually a photo I took of the deli on the corner near our office in New York that's been sitting empty ever since COVID, right? New York estimates that about 111 million annual loss in sales tax revenue as we all work from home 2 days a week now. So we're 3 days a week in the office, and you think about the delis that served all the office workers during the day, right? The tolls the city collected for drivers who commuted in on the bridges and the tunnels, right? The parking lots that collected money for people parking as they worked. All of these are really, really challenged by this shift. One, not only to a 4-day work week, but a hybrid model, right? So if you think about, we went from 5 days a week, we lost 40% of, if I'm a deli on the corner, I lost 40% of my weekday foot traffic. I don't open on the weekends, right? So there's enormous implications on how our business and our economy is going to have to restructure a little bit. Not all negative, right? There are many things. For example, eating at home has gone up. So you think of grocery stores, you think of many of the food production companies that do food at home. Obviously, delivery to home has gone up, but both good and bad, it has demonstrated a reshuffling of how we think about serving our customers, right? With 40% of the people, most of the people, working from home 2 days a week in many countries. That's again a 40% decrease in what happens during the weekdays, and then whether that's from office space lease to, as I said, some of these restaurants or retail foot traffic downtown will require a little bit of reimagining. But on the positive side, as I said, let's say we go to a 3-day weekend every weekend, so going to a 4-day week. The potential addition of 50% more leisure time will have huge impacts on brands that play in the space, right? This is an image from a Marriott hotel in Puerto Rico, which is now close enough for me to go for a 3-day weekend if it's every weekend, right? So if you think about a company like Marriott, that's huge, enormous hotels with a huge amount of infrastructure, this is going to actually require a great deal of reimagining, right? So they have hotels that tend to be business hotels, Monday through Thursday, Friday, very, very busy, and they're empty on the weekends, right? Let's just, for example, Sheraton in downtown Dallas, for example, right? Empty on the weekends, very busy during the weekdays. And they have the resort hotels like we see here, usually pretty empty Monday through Thursday, Thursday through Sunday, jam-packed, right? And so thinking about Marriott, we're gonna have to shuffle some of our inventory, and how do we redesign our properties to allow for the idea that you have a 3-day weekend every weekend, right? In New York, for example, the property values of homes that are 3 or 4 hours outside of the city have suddenly skyrocketed, because that means people can have a vacation home to go to every weekend. 3 or 4 hours is not so bad if I get to spend 3 days there every weekend, right? And there's a little bit of in Europe, we have this EasyJet effect, right? Where EasyJet's starting to fly to enough places that people can get away for a 3-day weekend every weekend. So again, some very tangible, challenging outcomes from this reimagining, reworking of work, and some very interesting opportunities that emerge. I think the final one here is that as remote work becomes quite commonplace, and we're starting to see this, there might be a shift to a freelance model, right? Where there are companies that will focus on freelance. Upwork is a freelance marketplace in the UK, US. They're seeing 35% CAGR year on year, right? Now, for companies that have traditionally relied on a regular salaried workforce, there's a lot to think about, from HR, legal, benefits, right? To how do we think about hiring? How do we think about training? How do we think about building culture for employees that are all remote? And all things that I know many of you are thinking about, but again, just one of the huge shifts that's happening that perhaps we're hacking our way through right now. We're saying, well, we're going to try this, we're going to try that. We have to land on what the new model is going to look like. And I think, again, final provocation for you to think about there. So how do we thrive in this context on reworking work? I think one is, how will your business change based on a 4-day work week, right? From whether that's food, whether that's leisure, whether that's infrastructure, right? We have these enormous parking lots of where people used to park their cars many days a week, no longer needed. How do we repurpose some of those spaces? Again, on the positive side, what happens when everyone has 50% more leisure time, right? AI is making things perhaps more efficient. It makes sense, right? If you think about, I say this all the time, if you think about our great-great-grandparents who perhaps were in agriculture, work 7 days a week, sun up to sundown, right? Then perhaps our grandparents that worked factories, and factories worked 6 days a week, right? You and our parents probably worked 5 days a week in office. It only makes sense as the world gets more efficient, as there's more tools, more automation, that we go to four days a week. And I say all the time, we think about how much time and energy was spent in the creation of food, meals, feeding people, right? And how much time do we spend now? Certainly gotten more efficient. So the idea that what does that look like as our leisure time continues to increase? And then finally, the last challenge is to reimagine your operations in the context of an increasing the short-term workforce. So what does it look like if we only have gig workers, right? What do they want? How do we ensure that they stay engaged? How do our operations need to evolve to be able to serve them? So those are the three big shifts that I'm seeing: just an emptier planet, a deglobalized globe, and reworking work. Again, slightly provocative there for you. Some of the things you're probably starting to see already, but I think my intention here is to really emphasize the impact that these three are going to have in the world, right? And certainly, they will be slow to take root. Population will not start to decrease until about mid-century, and we have 20 years. But again, these are things that we can't respond to very quickly. So there are things that will happen further out, but their responses will require our thinking today. And I guess the intention here is to really inspire, to nudge, to suggest that we start thinking about the implications of these shifts now. One of my favorite quotes is something that Al Gore said in relation to climate change, and that is quite relevant here as well. It's that things will take longer to happen than you think they would, but when they actually do happen, they happen faster than you thought they would. And so I would say this is the same case in all three of these provocations or these macro shifts that we'll see. So with that was about half of our time. I want to spend the other half of our time Mark will help me facilitate a discussion here. If there's any questions, if there's any other provocations, things that you're seeing in your businesses that perhaps support this, or also open to seeing things that are contrary to this. But again, open to the discussion. I think that's how a lot of these implications become really, really rich. So over to you, Mark. I don't know if you're seeing questions come through.
That's great, Oscar. That was fantastic. Thank you so much for that. That was a great whirlwind tour through what you're seeing. I hope you have a rev share on the Marriott in Puerto Rico. I think I'm trying to book it online as we speak. Oscar, maybe just to go through a couple of questions that have come in. One on, with all the work you're kind of seeing and with your experience in consumer packaged goods, maybe a little bit on innovation in marketing, social media, what impact, what trends, some things you're seeing there.
Yeah, good. I think we have more and more data, more and more inputs around social media, around trends. It's coming in all the time, and I think while it is access to that data is increasingly critical and increasingly powerful, I think sometimes it makes us increasingly short-sighted, right? I think social media is very good for us to kind of collect information, collect data, collect feedback, and it's a quick turnaround, which is really, really great. But people and consumers, I think, tend to respond to what's directly in front of their face, right? So they aren't thinking about, okay, what's going to happen when the world population starts to decline, right? I think that still requires a bit more of an academic view, a sit in a room. Let's really challenge, debate, spar with each other on this. I think, and part of the reason why I'm often surprised by how many business leaders are looking at directly in front of their face is because of social media, right? And they take social media and say, here are the big things. Here are the big things I'm seeing. I'm like, those are the big things that are flying around on social media. How are we talking about the right things longer term, right? And I think increasingly business leaders are going to have to be thinking about both short term and long term. The second part of your question, Mark, was really around innovation. Yep. And I think a lot of this, when we talk about innovation, it's not necessarily innovation of the next flavor of this or the next iteration of this. Some of this requires innovation. How do I rethink my business to operate in a world where, right? And again, as business leaders, that is our mandate. That's our necessity. But I think sometimes we get a little bit distracted by directly what's in front of our faces. Rightly so. We need to be responsive, right? I think, but my objective and what my firm does is often let's pick your head up, right? Eyes over here. I always say, these are some of the things that you should be looking at in addition to what you are working on. Right.
Amazing. Thanks, Oscar. And there's a couple of questions coming in the chat now, but just wanted to ask first, just your thoughts on kind of global workforce planning, AI, talent availability, what you're seeing.
Yeah. I think, listen, we all are seeing kind of the shifts in global workforce, right? This idea to 4 days a week is not insignificant. I think increasingly, and I hope I don't offend anyone here, we're seeing a different type of work ethic and commitment sometimes from Gen Z. They are innovative, they're smart, but my favorite quote, we do a survey with Gen Z on working, and they said, look, all of you old folks, you guys are all about work hard, play hard, which is kind of the mantra we've all lived with. Interestingly, this Gen Z person said, you know what? I work reasonably hard and I play reasonably hard, right? Which is a very interesting attitude. And so how do we get the most impactful work out of people? Perhaps shorter hours, perhaps less intensity. And I think that's going to have to be a shift, right? You are going to have, and you see this in China, right? They have this Tangping movement, which is like, I do all this work for nothing and it's not worth it. So we're going to have to start rethinking how we think about compensation, right? Not in terms of dollars and pounds and euros and yen, but how do we make sure that there's something fulfilling? And we see in all the data that Gen Z wants to enter the workforce and do work. Number one, that's fulfilling, right? And number two, that they find passionate and interesting. So I think the rework of work is going to have to require a lot of thinking there.
That's great. That's great. And Oscar, just another question that came in on impact of ESG sustainability, particularly amongst a lot of the companies that you're working with and have engaged with.
Yeah, I think it is something we all need to be thinking about, especially both as an employer and as a maker of products for customers, right? Increasingly, that is a requirement. But I think what's really critical is, again, thinking about the consumers in this world. They now have a much more transparency into our operations, right? Here are the things that you're doing in the world of ESG, in the world of sustainability. Here is the level of diversity on your board, right? That is all increasingly transparent. I think that we'll have to really think about that, because this is a generation that's coming into the workforce that will look all of that up and hold us accountable, right? I think really critical, for the sustainability of our planet, right? It's not just sell products to do well, it's sell products that do well and ensure that we are creating a prosperous planet in terms of many dimensions, right? Not just in terms of financial.
Yeah. Oscar, you mentioned a few kind of exciting business opportunities that you liked. Maybe could you share a little bit more on why you liked some of those business opportunities? Home delivery, you said wellness, like that will impact lifestyle, etc. Maybe share a little bit more on if there's any other areas that you find, maybe on the finance or technology side, that you find particularly interesting as we go forward.
Yeah, I think we as you said, Mark, think about the things that our world looks like today, right? So I'm at home a lot more. So as you said, things that facilitate that delivery. What does that look like? How do I make things more convenient for people? I think anything in the leisure space will be interesting, right? As we go to less work, to more free time. What does that look like? I think there'll be some really interesting avenues to explore there with the increase in leisure time. And then I think anything that follows, we talked about the Nike example of the Cruiser 1 shoe that's actually thinking about, okay, what is the true need that is emerging in this world, right? Not chasing, oh, we're going to chase the marathon runners because those are the people. Certainly they help build your brand, but on a pragmatic level, there's need a lot. We do a lot of work on accessibility, right? If there's a large number of seniors who perhaps their vision is they're limited, or their mobility is limited, what does that look like in terms of UX, right? Really good areas to explore, certainly.
I was going to ask, Oscar, is there any other, as some of the larger players are looking for increased market share, you mentioned like acquiring local brands. Is there any other kind of trends you're seeing in how companies are really focusing on grabbing up market share globally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to say something provocative here, in that I think the idea of market share is a little bit outdated. It's how many of the same product can I sell to more people compared to my competitor as quickly as I can, right? And I think that model, again, it's a metric that we all run by, right? But I suspect that model will be increasingly challenged, right? I don't know. I think some of the most interesting companies are the ones that have smaller share, higher margin, deeper customer commitment, right? I think we're doing some work in the beauty category, right? And the big players, the Estee Lauders, the L'Oreals, are really getting challenged. You've probably seen some of their recent earnings. I hope no one on the call is too impacted by that. But you see they're really getting challenged by these small niche players that understand a specific need super well and delivers it better than anyone else possibly can, right? I would suspect that those are the areas that will be really interesting going forward.
That's fantastic. And what else are you seeing, Oscar, in terms of like the creator economy, like cultural trends? I mean, going through Instagram, YouTube, what are you seeing there? I mean, there's so many incredible brands which just are coming out of absolutely.
I think it's interesting, right? It's happening. I don't know, the true percentage or number of creators that make enough money to survive, to feed themselves is very small, right? So there's a lot of noise and generating a lot of discussion, but I think to be a career where that can actually feed you, your family, is still increasingly challenging. The other piece that I will, it won't be a prediction, but I will kind of suspect that will happen is that we will have increasingly strict regulations on social media. And so I think there will be a tapering off. I wouldn't say it's dying, but it will be some sort of a mediation of everyone's a creator, everyone wants to do these things, because I think the social media sphere, the challenges and dangers of social media are increasingly becoming apparent, right? I would argue it's fanned the flames of some of the instability and conflict we're seeing today in the world, right? And that's becoming increasingly clear. And it's just the normal evolution of a business, right? If you think about automobiles started and you purposely open it up so that the industries can thrive and grow, but then you realize actually people are having a lot of car accidents and dying. So let's introduce airbags, let's introduce seat belts, right? Let's introduce these safety things that are going to be regulated and will force you to do that. Emissions, right? Because we're putting too many emissions in the world. And slowly the industry will get to an equilibrium that allows it to function well, but also allows it to protect the consumer. So I think that's coming in the world of social media. We've opened the gates to let it grow and prosper, and now I think it's time to start putting a few guardrails around it, seeing some of the dangers that have happened. So on the creator economy, yes, I think it's happening. I think watch the space carefully, because I think it will have to calm itself down a little bit in some words.
Thanks, Oscar. And Oscar, obviously we saw through the pandemic like explosive growth in e-commerce. I'm just wondering what trends are you seeing, innovation, growth? I mean, the stats kind of showed that within 3 months of the pandemic, e-commerce grew like in a typical kind of 10-year like period. So I'm just wondering where does it go from here? What are you seeing in e-commerce?
E-commerce itself is interesting, but I think the real interesting thing is that it's reshaping retail more broadly, right? If you think about the purpose if you think about a retail shop for decades, it had to do many things, right? It had to stock the inventory so you could go pick it up and take it home. It had to be able to be a space in which you could try and explore and touch the inventory and feel it and see it. And then it had to be able to be somewhere where you could transact, right? So that the purpose of a retail store was kind of threefold. It did all three of those things. I think with the introduction of e-commerce, the idea of having to store the inventory is no longer relevant, right? The need to transact itself is no longer needed in that space, right? Because all of that is almost better done online. And so the spaces we're looking at are going to have to be increasingly for that last piece, which is how do you educate, explore, touch, feel, learn, right? What are the other needs that people have when they shop? And it's not about transacting per se, but how do you, because that transaction is better done. Go home, do it online, do it on a tablet. We don't need that here now. But I think the shift in retail is a really, really interesting evolution.
Well, and Oscar, anything in terms of like the impact of 5G? I mean, in terms of like data collection, AI. I mean,
Yeah.
obviously making things that we spoke about so much easier. But are you seeing anything there or expecting any impact?
No, 5G will be a continuation of what we see today, right? The idea that you will have fast, blazing internet speeds on your device will allow more and more things to happen. I think it will. It's interesting. We will spend more and more of our time paying for the pipes, right? Because the pipes are increasingly important. But I think it is essentially an acceleration of what we see today. But with that acceleration also means that it will require more of what we crave. And in the end, we are human beings who are animals, who are social creatures. I think part of the reason, I don't know if anyone is here from Meta, but part of the reason why I think the metaverse never really took off with all that we had anticipated was we've forgotten that people in the end are social human beings that crave touch, that crave smell, that crave human interaction, right? So there will be the requirement of both, I think, going forward, certainly.
And Oscar, you touched upon it in the presentation on, remote hybrid work. Maybe could you share a little bit more on how companies are kind of gearing up for that in terms of expectations, alignment, reporting, what you're seeing there from some of the leading industry players?
Yeah, I don't know if anyone has gotten it right. Right now, we are in a kind of experimental period. We are trying to do what we used to do 5 days a week in 3 days, and then allowing people to work from home the other days, right? I think, and then we have the challenge. Of course, everyone's now used to this idea of remote work. Everyone's on a call all the time, and employees say, "Well, I come into the office and that's what I do. So why do I need to do this?" Right? I think there's a desire to return to the office, but I think the reality is that from leaders, there's a desire to return to the office, right? But I think you're used to it. We've forgotten that there's an entire generation now who is 3-4 years into working and has never gone into the office, and how do you know what you're missing and if you've never had it, right?
Yeah.
And so they don't really know what they're missing. So we can talk about the culture and the after work drinks and all the things that we do, I think are really, really critical. I don't know if the new generation cares, right? Again, it's work reasonably hard, play reasonably hard.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm working reasonably hard from home, and that's okay. And I have, I'm going to have 3-day weekends every week. So I think we are in a transition period, and again, that's why it's called reworking work. I think we have not landed on what's going to happen just yet.
Yeah, we just got a couple more questions in, Oscar. One on businesses experimenting with immersive technologies, AR, VR, mixed reality. What are you seeing in that space?
Yeah, I think it's going to happen, right? There will be AR, there will be VR, but again, I think all of the calls that it will replace what we do today is not going to come to pass. Right? We've had open air marketplaces since the beginning of humanity, right? The Greek agoras where everyone would bring their wares and they would sit there. We often think that the idea of e-commerce is exactly that. It's commerce. It's the transaction, right? I think we forget that shopping and buying is not solely about the transaction, right? There's other, I want to learn, I want to explore, I want to get ideas, I want to be inspired. I think all of that will increasingly have a role to play, which I think AI will help with. But in the end, all things happen in two ways, right? On the one hand, it gets increasingly easy. The transaction part gets increasingly easy. So that gives us room to build all the other pieces, which I think is an interesting prospect if you're a retailer.
Yeah. Oscar, are you seeing anything in terms of kind of the consumer demand on control of their data? Any trends in that area?
Well, the short answer is yes, absolutely. Consumers are demanding control, care for their data. I think the challenge is that they demand it in an amorphous form, right? I demand that I have data security. You must have data security. Oh, took my credit card number, so there was some fraud, and that was really bad. So I had to deal with it. Then I had to change all the things that I enter my credit card in. Yeah, that was annoying. So, but I still think, you know, data security for many, that's what it means, right? I think there's still some consumer learning on what true data security is. Hopefully, we'll never have to learn about it. But I think that's where, you know, consumers will demand it in some amorphous form, but it'll be up to the companies to actually think about what that looks like, because I think the impact is actually greater on companies, right? You know,
Yeah.
one data breach and you're, you know, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars in the hole. So
Yeah. Just even on the picture you put up of the deli on the corner, Oscar. I mean, what a sad sight. Like,
yeah, I knew the woman. I saw her every day, right? She was lovely. Would give you a free coffee every other day.
Yeah. Brought a tear to my eye.
Yeah.
I mean, just in terms of consumers wanting more like local shopping options, what are your view? What are the high streets going to look like in kind of major agglomerations?
Yeah, I mean, this is the interesting thing, right? I think, again, I tend to be quite optimistic on high streets, right? The idea that people do want interaction, they want to touch, they want to feel, but again, understanding that those may not be for transacting themselves, right? And you're starting to see this. There are things that require physicality, right? You're starting to see. If you were to ask me about the composition of a lot of high streets since the introduction of e-commerce, I would say the retailers have actually declined slightly, but the restaurants have gone up, right? The number of restaurant outlets out there are really interesting. I think in the US, at least, we are going under a restaurant renaissance, right? So the COVID kind of cleared out all the restaurants that weren't well operating. And importantly, the most expensive input into starting a restaurant is the build out, right? So I have a space, great. I need to put in a kitchen, and it needs to be within code of what it can do. I need plates, and I need glassware, and I need a bar, and all of these things. That's the real expense of starting a restaurant. We have many restaurants that basically just abandon their spaces through COVID. Okay, we give up, and you have a fully functioning space right there. So now the startup cost of starting a restaurant is actually quite low. This is all built out. I have all the stuff I need. I don't need to go out and buy a whole set of 500 plates, right? I have enough here to do a 15-seat restaurant. So I think there's going to be a restaurant renaissance in some of our high streets, and people, again, use those as entertainment spaces, less than the need to transact, because I think, as we said, the need to transact itself is actually moved online quite efficiently.
I don't know if you'd seen anything on this, Oscar, but just when I was doing a bit of research just for the call, just on Recommerce or demand for secondhand goods. I don't know if that's something you've seen, or any comments on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that has a lot to do with sustainability as well, right? The idea of buying and throwing things away is really coming under a little bit of scrutiny. And so the idea of Recommerce, it's also a great, and increasingly, again, we are humans in the end. The idea of storytelling about this good, where it came from and who it came from and who wore it before, I think all add to the richness of the things that we own. Those of you that perhaps are in the US, we have a website called The Real, right? Which actually goes and buys luxury goods from people. They make it super easy. I have an old, I don't know, Chanel coat from years ago. They will send someone and they will inspect it. They will make sure that it's authentic. They will do it, and then they will resell it. And I think there's a huge marketplace for that as well. And again, makes sense if you think about the demographic shifts that are coming. There will be fewer and fewer people in the world. It means there's actually more and more goods that are left over, right? That we can think about how we refashion, reimagine, reuse, recycle, right? Upcycle. I think there's some opportunity there, certainly.
Fantastic. Oscar, That's been amazing. That's been like super insightful, like so many great questions. What a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much on behalf of Ref for doing this for us and for being part of the series. And it's been great. And we'll see you in London or New York sometime soon again, I hope.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Amazing. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Bye now.
Bye-bye.